Have you ever noticed how some people talk endlessly about changing their lives, yet year after year they remain exactly the same? They don't lack information, they don't lack opportunities, they simply lack the courage to face what Jung called the terror of their own transformation. And suddenly you realize the uncomfortable truth. Most people would rather stay miserable than risk becoming unknown to themselves. Now imagine if you understood why this happens, why the human psyche fights so desperately against its own evolution. That's where the real revelation lies. When you stop being available to everyone, everything changes. But when you try to change yourself, everything resists. And this resistance doesn't come from the outside world, it comes from within. You have been taught that change is about willpower, about positive thinking, about setting goals and pushing through. But here's a truth that perhaps no one has told you with this clarity. Real change is not about becoming someone new. It's about destroying who you think you are. Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Do you know why? Because your current identity, no matter how limiting, no matter how painful, is familiar, it's predictable, it's safe, even if that safety is killing you slowly. Every time you say, "I want to change," a part of your psyche immediately begins calculating the cost. What will I lose? Who will I disappoint? What if I fail? What if I succeed and discover I don't know who I am anymore? This internal negotiation happens so fast, so unconsciously, that you mistake it for lack of motivation or willpower. But the truth is darker. Your resistance to change is not weakness. It's your psyche's desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control. Because change means death. Not physical death, but the death of the stories you've told yourself about who you are, what you're capable of, what you deserve. Think about this. How many times have you started a diet, a new exercise routine, a creative project, or tried to leave a toxic relationship, only to find yourself back where you started? You blamed external circumstances, bad timing, other people. But Jung understood something deeper. We are not changed by insight alone. We are changed by accepting the terror of becoming. Your current life, your current patterns, your current limitations, they form what Jung called the ego structure. This is not your true self. This is the construction you've built to survive, to be accepted, to avoid the unbearable anxiety of not knowing who you are. And this construction will fight for its life every time you threaten it with genuine transformation. The people around you have invested in your current version. They know how to relate to your limitations, your complaints, your familiar struggles. When you start to change, you disturb their own psychological equilibrium, so they become unconscious saboteurs, pulling you back into old patterns with guilt, with need, with familiar drama. But here's what most people don't realize. True change is not addition, it's subtraction. It's not about adding new habits, new beliefs, new strategies. It's about removing the psychological barriers that keep you small, that keep you safe, that keep you trapped in a life that feels like it belongs to someone else. Every genuine transformation requires what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period where you must let go of who you've been without yet knowing who you're becoming. And this terrifies most people so deeply that they choose the familiar prison over the unknown freedom. Do you know what happens to someone who refuses this death and rebirth cycle? They become what Jung called provisional, living a half-life, always preparing to begin, always about to change, always one day away from their real existence. They collect self-help books like talismans. They attend seminars, watch videos, make plans. But they never take the one step that matters. Accepting that change requires the complete destruction of their current self-concept. This is why most people will never change. Not because they can't, but because they won't pay the psychological price. They want transformation without dissolution, growth without loss, becoming without unbecoming. But that's not how the psyche works. That's not how life works. If you've made it this far, if these words are creating discomfort in your chest, it's because a part of you recognizes this truth. A part of you is tired of being provisional, tired of living in the small circle of your familiar suffering. And that part of you is about to discover why the terror of change is actually the gateway to authentic existence. But before we go deeper, we need to understand what Jung discovered about the architecture of human resistance. Because your inability to change is not a personal failure. It's a design feature of the human psyche. And once you understand this design, you can work with it instead of against it. Jung spent his entire life studying why people remain stuck, why they cling to suffering they claim to want to escape. And what he found was revolutionary. We don't resist change because we're lazy or weak. We resist change because transformation threatens the very foundation of our psychological survival. Every human being develops what Jung called a persona, a carefully constructed mask that helps us navigate the world, earn love, avoid rejection, maintain belonging. This persona is not who you are. It's who you had to become to survive your childhood, your culture, your circumstances. But over time, you forgot it was a mask. You began to believe it was your face. Your persona carries with it a complete worldview. What's possible for someone like you, what you deserve, how much pain you should expect, how small you should stay to remain safe. This worldview becomes your prison, but it's a familiar prison. You know every corner, every shadow, every way to minimize the pain of living within its walls. When you try to change, really change, not just improve or optimize, you threaten this entire structure. You threaten not just your habits, but your identity, not just your behaviors, but your beliefs about reality itself. And your psyche responds as if its life depends on stopping you. Because, in a sense, it does. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to bridge the gap between who you are and who you're becoming. But this function only activates when you're willing to hold the tension of opposites, the terror of staying the same and the terror of changing. Most people collapse this tension too quickly. They either give up on change or they try to force it, and both approaches fail. Here's what Jung discovered. Authentic change happens not through willpower, but through what he called active imagination, the ability to dialogue with the parts of yourself that resist transformation. Instead of fighting your resistance, you learn to understand it. You discover that your fear of change is actually your psyche's way of protecting something valuable. But there's a deeper layer. Jung realized that most people's resistance to change is actually resistance to their own potential. We are terrified not of failing, but of discovering how powerful we actually are. Because power brings responsibility, authenticity brings isolation, growth brings the loss of familiar connections. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Why? Because when you accept yourself completely, you can no longer hide behind your limitations. You can no longer blame your circumstances, your past, other people for the life you're not living. Complete self-acceptance means complete responsibility for your existence. Think about the people in your life who complain constantly about their situations, but never take action to change them. They're not lazy, they're terrified. Terrified that if they really tried and still failed, they would have to face the possibility that this is all they're capable of. But they're even more terrified that if they really tried and succeeded, they would have to live up to that success for the rest of their lives. This is why most self-help fails. It addresses the symptoms, the behaviors, the habits, the strategies, but it never touches the deeper terror. The terror of becoming responsible for your own existence, the terror of living without excuses, the terror of discovering that you are far more powerful and far more alone than you ever imagined. Jung understood that every genuine transformation involves what he called the encounter with the shadow. the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, hidden away. Your shadow contains not just your dark impulses, but your unlived potentials, your rejected gifts, your authentic power. Most people will spend their entire lives avoiding this encounter because it requires admitting that they have been living a fraction of their actual existence. But here's the cruelest point. The longer you avoid this encounter, the more your unlived life haunts you. It shows up as depression, as anxiety, as a persistent sense that something is missing, that you're living someone else's life. Jung called this the unlived life, the accumulation of all the potentials you've rejected in order to remain safe, accepted, small. Do you know what happens to people who spend decades avoiding their own transformation? They become what Jung called bitter. Not just disappointed or frustrated, but psychologically bitter. They begin to resent others who dare to change, who dare to grow, who dare to become. They become unconscious saboteurs of transformation, pulling others down into the familiar misery of stagnation. And here comes the most uncomfortable truth. If you're not changing, you're not just staying the same. You're slowly dying. The life force that should be flowing through growth, through becoming, through transformation, begins to turn inward, creating depression, physical illness, a sense of meaninglessness that no amount of comfort or distraction can heal. Jung saw this pattern over and over in his patients, people who were successful by external measures but dying inside because they had never risked becoming who they actually were. They had spent so much energy maintaining their persona, their acceptable mask, that they had lost touch with their authentic self entirely. But there is another way. There is a path through this terror, through this resistance, through this psychological death that transformation requires, but it demands something that most people are not willing to give: the complete surrender of your familiar self-concept, the willingness to become a stranger to yourself, the courage to live without knowing who you are. And that is what we will explore next. Because once you understand that change is not about improving yourself, but about destroying your current self-concept, everything becomes possible. But first, you must be willing to enter what Jung called the chaos of transformation, the space between who you were and who you're becoming. Are you ready for that level of psychological courage? Are you ready to stop being provisional and start being real? Because what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about yourself. The path of genuine transformation begins with a single, terrifying realization. You're not who you think you are. Everything you call myself, your preferences, your fears, your limitations, your stories about what's possible, is a construction, a psychological edifice built over years of conditioning, trauma, and compromise. And Jung understood that you cannot renovate this edifice. You must tear it down and build from the ground up. This is why most change efforts fail before they begin. People want to improve their current self, optimize their existing patterns, add new behaviors to their familiar identity. But authentic transformation doesn't work that way. It requires what Jung called psychological death, the complete dissolution of your current self-concept so that something new can emerge. But here's what no one tells you. This death is not metaphorical. It's visceral. It's terrifying. It feels like you're losing your mind, your identity, your place in the world. Because you are. Jung called this phase the dark night of the soul, and it's the initiation that everyone who truly changes must pass through. When you begin this process, your psyche will throw everything it has at you to make you stop. You'll experience what feels like a complete identity crisis. Who are you if you're not the struggling person you've always been? Who are you if you're not defined by your familiar limitations? Who are you if you're not the victim of your circumstances? This is where most people turn back. They mistake the chaos of transformation for evidence that they're going in the wrong direction. They interpret the discomfort as a sign that they should return to their familiar prison. But Jung understood that this chaos is not a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's the psyche's way of creating space for something new to emerge. The first step in navigating this chaos is learning to distinguish between your ego's voice and your authentic self's voice. Your ego, the constructed identity you've been mistaking for yourself, will tell you that change is dangerous, that you should stay small, that you don't deserve more, that you'll only disappoint yourself and others. This voice is not your enemy, but it's also not your guide. It's the voice of survival, not of growth. Your authentic self speaks differently. It doesn't argue with your limitations. It simply transcends them. It doesn't fight your fears. It moves through them. It doesn't seek permission or validation. It acts from an inner knowing that doesn't require external proof. But learning to hear this voice requires what Jung called active imagination, the ability to create a dialogue between your conscious mind and your unconscious wisdom. This is not positive thinking or affirmations. This is a genuine conversation with the parts of yourself that know who you really are beneath all the conditioning. Jung developed specific techniques for this dialogue. He would have patients imagine conversations with their resistance, with their fears, with the parts of themselves they had rejected. Through these conversations, people discovered that their resistance to change was not opposition, it was protection. Their psyche was trying to keep them safe from the terror of their own potential. Here's a practical approach Jung would use. When you feel resistance to change, don't fight it. Interview it. Ask your resistance, what are you protecting me from? What do you need me to know? What would happen if I changed? Listen to the answers without judgment. Often, you'll discover that your resistance is based on outdated beliefs, childhood fears, or traumatic experiences that no longer apply to your current reality. But the real transformation happens when you start taking action from your authentic self, not from your ego. This means making decisions based on what calls to your soul, not what makes sense to your mind. It means choosing growth over comfort, truth over approval, authenticity over acceptance. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. And he was clear that this journey requires complete psychological sovereignty. You must stop looking to others for permission to be yourself. You must stop seeking external validation for your internal truth. You must become your own authority. This is where the real terror begins. Because when you stop deriving your sense of self from external sources, from others' opinions, from social roles, from familiar patterns, you enter what feels like a void. Who are you when you're not performing a role? Who are you when you're not trying to be acceptable? Who are you when you're not defined by your limitations? Jung called this the encounter with the self, the discovery of your authentic nature beneath all the conditioning. But this encounter requires tremendous courage because it means accepting responsibility for your entire existence. No more blaming circumstances, parents, society, or bad luck for the life you're not living. Complete responsibility means complete power, and complete power terrifies most people more than complete powerlessness. The practical steps of this transformation are deceptively simple but psychologically demanding. First, stop identifying with your story, the narrative you tell about who you are, what you've been through, what you're capable of. This is not you. This is your ego's attempt to create continuity and control. Start referring to these stories in the third person. That's a story I used to tell myself, instead of, that's who I am. Second, cultivate what Jung called creative indifference. Stop needing to be understood, approved of, or validated by others. Their opinions of you are none of your business. Their projections onto you are about them, not you. When you stop caring about being misunderstood, you free your energy for actual growth. Third, embrace what Jung called the tension of opposites. You are both limited and unlimited, both human and divine, both individual and universal. Stop trying to resolve this paradox and learn to live within it. This tension is the creative force that generates authentic transformation. Fourth, develop your own relationship with meaning. Stop looking for purpose outside yourself. Stop waiting for someone else to give your life significance. Jung understood that meaning is not found. It's created through the act of becoming authentic. Your life becomes meaningful when you start living it from your center, not from your circumstances. The people around you will not understand this transformation. They knew how to relate to your limitations, your complaints, your familiar struggles. When you start operating from authentic power, instead of reactive patterns, you disturb their psychological equilibrium. They will try to pull you back into old dynamics through guilt, through need, through familiar drama. This is where many people abandon their transformation. They mistake others' discomfort with their growth as evidence that they're being selfish or wrong. But Jung understood that your obligation is not to make others comfortable with your growth. It's to grow anyway. The path of individuation is necessarily lonely, not because you become isolated, but because you become self-contained. You stop needing others to complete you, to validate you, to give your life meaning. You become whole within yourself. And wholeness in a world of fragmented people can feel like betrayal to those who depend on your brokenness to feel normal. But here's what Jung discovered through decades of guiding people through this process. On the other side of this psychological death and rebirth, you don't become a different person. You become yourself. You discover capacities you didn't know you had, strength you didn't know you possessed, a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, a joy that doesn't require reasons. And the most surprising discovery, the things you were afraid of losing through change, love, connection, belonging, these become available to you in their authentic forms only after you've stopped seeking them from others and started generating them from within. But this transformation comes with a price that not everyone is willing to pay. And that price is the complete destruction of your victim story, your limitation story, your I can't because story. Are you ready to pay that price? Are you ready to discover how powerful you actually are? Because what comes next will show you what life looks like when you stop being provisional and start being real. When you finally surrender to the complete dissolution of who you thought you were, something extraordinary happens. First comes the silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of infinite potential. You discover that beneath all your conditioning, all your fears, all your limitations, there is something indestructible. Jung called it the self. Your authentic essence that exists beyond personality, beyond ego, beyond the small stories you've been telling about your life. This is not a gradual improvement of your old self. This is the emergence of a completely different way of being. You stop seeking validation because you become your own source of approval. You stop fearing rejection because you're no longer dependent on others' acceptance for your sense of worth. You stop worrying about failure because you understand that every experience is simply information, not judgment. The people who knew your old patterns will be confused, sometimes threatened by this transformation. They will say you've changed, as if that's an accusation. But you haven't just changed, you've awakened to who you were always capable of being. And some relationships will not survive this awakening, not because you've become cold or uncaring, but because they were based on dysfunction, on mutual limitation, on shared smallness. But what emerges in their place is far more profound. You begin to attract people who resonate with your authenticity rather than your neediness. You create connections based on mutual growth rather than mutual limitation. You participate in life from a place of contribution rather than consumption. Jung understood that this rebirth is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process of becoming. Every time you choose authenticity over approval, growth over comfort, truth over convenience, you die a little to the old way of being and are reborn to your authentic power. This is why transformation is not something you achieve, it's something you live. The most profound shift is in your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of trying to control outcomes, you learn to trust your ability to navigate whatever emerges. Instead of needing to know the future, you become confident in your capacity to create it. Instead of fearing the unknown, you recognize it as the space where all possibility lives. You realize that your old resistance to change was actually resistance to your own magnificence. You were not afraid of failure. You were afraid of success. Not afraid of being rejected, but of being truly seen. Not afraid of losing others, but of finding yourself. And now that you've found yourself, now that you've remembered who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, you face a new choice. Will you use this power to create a life that reflects your authentic nature? Or will you shrink back into familiar limitations because your magnitude feels too overwhelming to sustain? This is the choice that determines whether your transformation becomes permanent awakening or temporary inspiration. And the choice is always, in every moment, entirely yours. Today, we learned from Carl Jung that the terror of transformation is actually the gateway to authentic existence, and that most people will never change not because they can't, but because they won't pay the psychological price of complete self-dissolution and rebirth. If these insights sparked a moment of uncomfortable recognition in you, if they revealed the familiar prison of your provisional existence, hit the like button to share this wisdom with others who might be ready to stop living half-lives. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Join our community of courageous souls exploring the depths of psychological transformation and philosophical awakening. We dive deeper into life-changing ideas that challenge you to become who you actually are, beyond all conditioning and limitation. Write in the comments, "I choose transformation over comfort." Let's see how many here are ready to stop being provisional and start being real. Your authentic self is waiting for your courage to meet it. And don't forget, keep watching the next video. We'll explore why your unlived life is more dangerous than any risk you could take in living it fully. Until we meet again, carry Jung's wisdom forward. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. See you next time.